Hello everyone, welcome to the UB Financial Social Work video. This is part one in a series that we'll be following over the next week or so. This is recorded and published on July 5th, 2020, and my name is Daniel Khan, MBA MSW, graduating from UB in 21. Today we're going to be talking about credit cards, debt, and poverty capitalism. So this is where we are right now. I wanted to find some data that reflected the impacts of COVID-19 from a financial standpoint. However, this data is the most recent that we currently have from the publishing of the video, and it reflects consumer credit data as of March 31st of this year. This is essentially encompassing the first quarter of 2020, whereas you probably know most of the effects of COVID-19 we're following this going into April, May, and June. And so that report will be coming up later in the quarter two report. But as of right now, I wanted to focus on what we currently have. So I highlighted credit card debt because this is essentially our consumer debt and will be a main priority to talk about during this series of presentations. As of right now, as you can see on the right, we currently stand at $0.89 trillion in credit card debt. That's $890 billion. But this last quarter, from quarter four of 2019 until this first quarter of 2020, we've actually decreased our debt burden by approximately $34 billion. Now, this is in comparison to our top three sources of household debt, that being an increase in auto debt, an increase in student debt, and a very large increase in our mortgage debt. These currently stand at $9.7 trillion in mortgage debt, $1.54 trillion in student debt, and $1.35 trillion in auto debt, which is, car financing, for example. Now let's take a look at delinquencies. Delinquencies being the number of credit lines extended to consumers and the types of debt that are not paid for at least 2 months. And this is specific to credit cards. So this is spanning 3 years from March of 2017 to March of 2020. In March of 2017, we had about 4.8% delinquency, whereas we stand now after a very steady increase, we're at about 6% delinquency. But these delinquencies are heavily concentrated in certain regions of the United States. And you can see the darkest red states are the ones that carry the highest concentrations of delinquencies in consumer debt lines. This is as of March 2020. And you can see that these red states, including Oklahoma, Louisiana, Mississippi, Tennessee, for example, have delinquency rates from 9.4 to nearly 12.6%, which is effectively double the national delinquency rate. But I was curious about who traditionally suffers from these delinquency rates the most. And I believe that poverty and delinquency rates correlated to one another. So I found a map of the concentrations of poverty in the United States by county. And you can see that the darkest regions on this map represent the greatest poverty rates. You can see that it's spread all over the country, but as you might have guessed, the same regions where you have the highest concentrations of delinquency also correlate with the highest concentrations of poverty. The United States as a whole in 2018 has a poverty rate of around 14%. Where in states like Kentucky, you see rates nearly 18%, Louisiana, almost 20%, and in Mississippi, an astounding 21% approximately. But that's not just it, because these counties that you can see within each state can have poverty rates 30, 40% or greater. And so we have to really consider this because states, for example, like Kentucky and Tennessee, have very large shares of delinquent consumer credit lines that are among the highest in the country. And so this is important for implementing policies for new lending facilities and legislation so that policymakers can try to determine where debt and liquidity relief are most required in the country. And so with COVID-19, what are some of the resources that are available? Of course, the information I just shared, again, is not considering the highest impact of COVID-19 likely that is going to come in the Q2 report. But still, it's important to mention some of the resources that we can talk to with our clients and to consider for ourselves. You may have heard of the CARES Act, which stands for Coronavirus Aid, Relief, and Economic Security Act. This has included the stimulus package, the check that we received, some of the changes in unemployment. But to highlight here, I wanted to talk about the provisions for deferring debt payments. And these are on federally backed mortgages and student loans for a certain period. Because a lot of us are students or former students, to mention that student loan are now being applied 0% forbearance, which basically means from March 13th through September 30th of this year, those payments are not accumulating interest if they are backed federally. This applies to direct loans, FFVL, federal Perkins loans, whether or not they are defaulted, and also defaulted HEAL loans, which are related to health services. There is zero interest being applied, which means if you can't pay your student loans, you will not be accumulating interest during that time. And if you are paying your student loans, that money you're applying is going to go towards your principal. The other resource to mention is that because credit reports are legally mandated to be available to consumers every year, meaning every 12 months, you are able to get a free credit report from Experian, TransUnion, and Equifax. And by doing that, you can see your history of credit lines, credit extended, debt owed, canceled accounts, and also be able to monitor potential fraudulent activity that is now being available to the public weekly, which is actually very nice. So every week, you are able to access a report from each of these different agencies until April 20th of 2021 because of COVID-19. This is important because especially if you're making a large purchasing decision, like buying a house, for example, you're going to want to have your credit reports in order. And even if you're not planning a major decision, just to be able to monitor to see where you're currently standing and how your credit lines and credit history have impacted your score, you can do this every week. And because these agencies might have some different information, it might be best to space this out over time to make sure that there is no fraudulent activity on your account and that you have an accurate assessment of your credit standing. So now let's talk about some of the history of consumer debt, the current standing of consumer debt, and why it matters so much to us as social workers and to the discipline of social work itself. We have a history of punishing our debtors. In ancient Greece, for example, a person, if they were unable to pay their debts, they and their family could be forced into servitude as debt slaves of the creditor until their debt was paid off. In ancient Rome, if one became insolvent and unable to pay their debts, Roman law permitted the debtor's creditors to dismember and distribute a debtor's body to the creditors in proportion to the amount of debts owed to each. So the old adage of costing you an arm and a leg was taken quite literally in Roman law. Beyond that, with maybe potentially less intense ways of punishing debtors, we have debtors' prisons. And these prisons, jails, or detention facilities were meant to incarcerate people for their inability, refusal, or failure to pay debt. These existed in Victorian England and proceeded towards 19th and 20th century in the United States, but they were banned under federal law in the US in 1833. And then in 1983, 150 years later, the Supreme Court affirmed that incarcerating indigent meaning poor, debtors was unconstitutional under the 14th Amendment's Equal Protection Clause. So good. At least we discovered that we shouldn't be punishing already poor people by incarcerating them for their debt, right? You think we learned from this and that we deemed it unconstitutional so that it no longer exists? Well, I've been doing research, and it certainly still exists today. You can see that what is known as a modern day debtor's prison is articulated by research done in organizations like the American Civil Liberties Union, ACLU, and some statistics that they've gathered in their research includes the following. 1 in 3 Americans has a debt that has been turned over to a private collection agency, and more on that coming up. The ACLU has found cases in which threatening letters were sent to debtors for bounce checks as low as $2, and these threats involve civil and criminal action against them. During these civil and criminal cases, debtors are represented by lawyers in fewer than 2% of collection agencies. You might be thinking about how criminal cases you're entitled to legal representation, but in many of these civil cases involving debt collection, you are not granted that liberty, which leads to this statistic. And 90% of debt cases conclude in a default judgment against the defendant. A quote from the ACLU.org's article about this research that they've conducted on mass incarceration and criminalization of poverty. They say that the criminalization of private debt happens when judges, at the request of collection agencies that they often hire, issue arrest warrants for people who failed to appear in court to deal with unpaid civil debt judgments. In many cases, the debtors were unaware that they were even sued in the first place or had not received ample notice to show up in court. And this is coupled by the speed and lack of scrutiny that judges give to these collection lawsuits as they churn through them. And over 95% of debt collection suits will inevitably end in favor of the collector, because these debtors aren't able to establish a good enough defense when they're not represented by lawyers. These debtors who miss the court dates will often miss not just because of the minimal communication of these notices, but also due to work and childcare responsibilities, a lack of transportation, physical disability, illness, dementia, or taking care of loved ones who are afflicted by the same ailments. And again, these are just for bounce checks for as little as $2. Even if they are not jailed, the information often will remain in background check databases, which can impact future employment, housing applications, education opportunities, and access to security clearances. And the thing is, people who are jailed or threatened with jail are often the most vulnerable Americans who are already living paycheck to paycheck, one emergency away from a financial catastrophe. In the more than 1,000 cases that were reviewed by the ACLU, many were struggling to recover after the loss of a job, mounting medical bills, the death of a family member, a divorce, or an illness. And to be more related to current affairs, potentially impacted by the pandemic we've been facing. Now, this map is almost entirely red because 44 states that are in red, these states allow civil court judges to issue arrest warrants for debtors, meaning that $2 of a bounce check that was owed in private debt that would only become a bankruptcy or civil case would then lead to a warrant for their arrest and contempt of court that leads to criminal proceedings. And so I wanted to highlight what I call the cycle of the 21st century debtor's prison. It starts with someone like you and I who owes a debt. Now, this can be student loans, it can be credit cards, it can be rent, utilities, whatever it is. But a debtor will owe money to a creditor, that being a predatory lender, a landlord, a utility provider, whomever it is. Now, it can be very easy for these payments to become delinquent or unpaid, especially when you consider statistics that say anywhere from 50 to 80% of Americans are living paycheck to paycheck and aren't able to afford an emergency. So when an emergency does arise, medical, losing a job, whatever it is, they might not be able to pay these debts off. And so what happens is one way is a creditor who initially extended this loan or credit to a debtor will, instead of trying to collect it themselves, will hire a private collection agency or private collector to collect this debt for them. And so this becomes a civil case, bypassing bankruptcy court and taking the debtor straight to civil court. Now, if the creditor, original creditor, did not already sell or consolidate the debt to a private collector, that's what often the civil courts will do. If the creditor takes the case directly to civil court and files a lawsuit, the civil courts often don't have the time or resources to collect debts from debtors, so they themselves will hire private collection agencies to do it for them. There are many reasons for this that I'll highlight later. But when you have this, these private collection agencies will have the authority of law behind them and be able to threaten these debtors with a case against them. And if they don't appear at a court date, they risk warrant for their arrest and contempt of court. And for many of the aforementioned reasons involved in why a person might not actually know they're being sued in the first place, it's very easy for a debtor to all of a sudden have this civil case from private debt turn into a criminal case that leads to criminal justice debt on top of it. And this is all at the discretion of the private collection agencies and the individual judges. A term known as mens rea, which is essentially the discretion of a judge to determine whether someone is indigent and unable to pay a debt, or if they willfully neglected the debt. When it's up to them, they can file a warrant for their arrest and turn this civil case into a criminal case. The thing is, indigent defendants have a right to counsel in criminal cases, but not in civil ones. But they may be jailed for failing to show up at a civil hearing for not resolving their civil debt. And so poor people with debt face criminal consequences, but without the constitutional protections afforded to criminal defendants. And so these poor individuals who have little to no means to pay off their private debt will be followed by a civil proceeding that could have criminal consequences if they are not able to show up to court, for example. These criminal proceedings will then create more debt that is an obligation of the debtor, who couldn't even afford to pay off their original debt in the first place, which is what sparks more and more of this cycle occurring. And so, in terms of going to jail, if you go to jail, let's say for not making your court appearance, let's say you weren't able to pay off your debt, you weren't able to make it to court because you were taking care of a child, someone who was sick in your life, or if you had a disease yourself that you were taking care of, like you had medical expenses, for example. Well, imagine you have to go to jail now. You have to find someone to take care of your child, to take care of your loved one. Your loved one might lose their life because you are no longer available to them. And not only this jail time there, but you also have to post bail to get out of jail pre-trial. And municipalities and these courts will often just set the bail amount to the debt that they already owed. And this is what's known as a pay to stay, because people who are in jail will have to pay to be in jail, and it's their obligation to pay off that debt. And this leads to criminal debt, criminal justice debt, on top of the private debt they owed, with the consequences that lead from it. Consequences, even if you're not jailed, there is that background check information that still stays in the system. If you are jailed, you face less employment opportunities. Your chances of getting into certain educational institutions is mitigated, and you have more debt that is owed, restarting the cycle back over again, with more and more of that debt being sold between different private collection agencies who want you to have more and more debt. So instead of enslaving people literally and dismembering them, we do something where it's almost even more sinister by giving them more debt, giving them more credit lines, and further enslaving them in this whole cycle. A lot of this is on the backbone of the prison industrial complex that we have in the United States and the idea of mass incarceration. Poor people are targeted, as well as the racial inequities that we face when it comes to this poverty capitalism. And citing this New York Times article by Thomas Edsall on the expanding world of poverty capitalism, the recent drive toward privatization of government functions has turned traditional public services into profit-making enterprises as well. You look at this statistic that's pretty shocking, in that nearly half of people who make an income of less than $10,000 a year are arrested multiple times. And that the median bail bond amount, if you're sent to jail in this country, represents 8 months of income for the typical detained defendant. 8 months of hard work on top of the other challenges you might already be facing in your life just to post bail and get out of jail. These collection companies that are hired to manage and collect debt, as well as the services they offer, are very appealing to politicians and public officials. And this is for several reasons. For one, they cut government costs. They alleviate the burden on taxpayers and shift it onto the offenders. And more than that, for these offenders who are often arrested multiple times, who only make less than $10,000 a year, they also have less political influence, mainly because many of them don't even have the right to vote after they've been incarcerated. But for the taxpayers and for voters, many of them believe that this type of punishment is crucial in administering justice. And so this system of offender-funded law enforcement creates this vicious circle. The poorer the defendants are, the longer it will take them to pay off the fines, fees, and charges. The more debt they accumulate, private and criminal justice, and the longer they will remain on probation or in jail. This also leads to a greater likelihood that they are to be unemployable and therefore become recidivists, entering back into this system of incarceration. Because if you lose your employment opportunities or opportunities to get education, where are you going to look aside from public assistance and criminality to feed your family or to just take care of your basic necessities? The more commercialized fee collection and probation services get too, because you do have to pay for your own probation and parole as well, the more the costs of these services are inflicted on the poor. When that happens, people get resentful, and they specifically target their resent toward the police and law enforcement. And judges, it's hard to blame judges too, because although it's their determination in the grand scheme of things to warrant arrest and contempt of court, there's so much pressure on them to be reelected, because they need to cut administrative costs from the taxpayers while also maintaining an efficacious justice system. And so poverty capitalism and government policy work both individually and in tandem to shift the costs to those who are least equipped to pay them, specifically to the least politically influential segment of the poor, that being criminal defendants and those delinquent and paying fines. Now, there are a few suggestions for reform that I found from the Prison Policy Initiative, some of them including eliminating the use of money bail, to stop locking people up for failure to pay fees and fines, to reduce the number of arrests and jail bookings, for increased use of citations and diversion programs, one of which I'll talk about here in Buffalo, and to eliminate pay-to-stay programs and increase funding for indigent criminal defense so that they actually have a greater likelihood of defending themselves in court. So in Buffalo, I wanted to highlight some of the work that a local organization has done in the past, that being Black Love Resists in the Rust. And so in terms of poverty, capitalism, and racism in Buffalo, Black Love Resists in the Rust filed a lawsuit against the city of Buffalo in 2018 to target the ticketing practices that they believe have caused thousands of low-income residents of color to lose their driver's license, for it to be suspended. They found, and they cited in their lawsuit, from police data between 2013 to 2017, that more than 85% of checkpoints in these ticketing practices, 85% of those checkpoints were done in Black and Latino neighborhoods. And 30% of an increase was seen in issuing tickets for driving with a suspended license. And driving with a suspended license is a criminal offense. That 30% increase was seen between the years of 2014 and 2017, according to DMV data. And this is important to recognize because this quote below states that drivers who live in majority Black neighborhoods were 8 times more likely to receive multiple traffic tickets on a single stop than those living in majority white neighborhoods. 8 times more likely to receive multiple traffic tickets on a single stop. And 4 times more likely to have their license suspended for not paying tickets for all of the traffic tickets that they've been accumulating for things that should have only been maybe one citation or none at all. And so that 30% increase in tickets for people driving without a license that's not suspended, or the 30% increase in tickets for driving with a suspended license, well, if you're 4 times more likely to have your license suspended for not paying the 8 times more likely multiple tickets that you're getting for single stops, this is all perpetuating itself, and it's all targeting Black neighborhoods and often Hispanic neighborhoods as well. Over 12 weeks of checkpoints in 2017 alone, police issued 386 tickets for tinted windows. During that same 12 weeks, they seized 1 gun and they confiscated narcotics 5 times. Whereas they gave tickets for 386 for tinted windows. And so because of the creation of this Buffalo Traffic Violations Agency that's perpetuating these ticketing practices, people are saying that policing has been more aggressive and ticketing has become more aggressive and salient here in Buffalo. There was a quote from Investigative Post that half a dozen motorists who, when ticketed for tinted windows, they were given 1 ticket for each window. There was actually one gentleman who said that he received 13 tickets during a single stop on Bailey Avenue a few years ago, and included 4 tickets for his tinted windows. You know, one ticket per window that was tinted, and as well as several other tickets for various other violations that have been piled up. And this is also not considering the other costs and fees involved, because after 90 days of delinquency, the traffic agency files a civil judgment against the driver with the Erie County Clerk's Office, and that wreaks havoc on a person's credit score. And the cost is an additional $100. Now, in 2019, the traffic agency expected to file about 4,000 civil judgments that year. And Michael Kearns, of the who's the Erie County Clerk, he pulled a civil judgment filed by the traffic agency, and the costs were not only that $100 administrative fee, but a $90 late fee and an additional $150 fine. Claudia Wilner, who's an attorney working on the case, and she's also an expert in license suspensions with the National Center of Law and Economic Justice, said that excessive and multiple ticketing can drive even more suspensions. Like I mentioned, that quote at the bottom, 8 times more likelihood to receive multiple traffic tickets for a single stop, 4 times more likely to have their license suspended for not paying those multiple tickets, And that led to 30% more tickets of a criminal offense because of those suspensions. I also want to cite Rebecca Town, who's an attorney with the Legal Aid Bureau of Buffalo, and that she would like to see residents being offered a payment plan that's linked to their income, so that instead of targeting poor people and expecting them to pay all these fines, have it linked to their income, in which they could avoid being suspended so that they can still drive and get to work, for example, or be able to drive to the hospital or see a loved one in case of a medical emergency, but require them to still pay on this payment plan while keeping their license. Because, putting it simply, we're criminalizing poverty. And by avoiding suspension, we can actually potentially sidestep the indirect economic impacts of people not being able to get to work, for example. So one recent study from the Seidman Research Institute in Arizona found that at least 28% of drivers lost their job due to license suspension. They couldn't get to work, so they had to get fired. They lost their job. 28% of those drivers. But on the bright side, some municipalities have actually found ways of allowing people to pay their debts, as Rebecca Town had suggested, over a period of time. And it actually meant not only being able to reduce suspension, but also collect more money for what was owed. So for instance, one county in Florida, according to Chicago Fines, Fees, and Access Collaborative, that one county in Florida found that by implementing low-cost payment plans, they collected 32 times, I said that correctly, collected 32 times more revenue and decreased license suspensions by 36%. That is significant. So not only can we help the people whose licenses are being suspended, specifically it looks like in black neighborhoods, but also we can have more revenue for cities potentially like Buffalo. Maybe this is something that we can work towards and show the data that around the country and potentially around the world, these ways to reduce recidivism, license suspension, to keep people in the jobs they already have and stop piling up all this money in this offender-funded system that we have of poverty capitalism, we can also have more revenue for the city and municipality themselves. And so that's what I wanted to end this section on, because there is a lot that you and I can do as social workers, and by learning the history and the current state of where we're at in terms of consumer debt and how it's being used to target the most vulnerable populations and least influential segments of our country, we can do something to tackle our spending behavior and to implement policy reform that actually benefits people and produces more revenue and less criminal activity for our communities. And so part 2 is going to be about credit card use and debt basics that you and I can use personally and that we can share with our clients. I'll also have a reference list of the abundance of articles that I read through for this video. And thank you so much for your time. I hope you watched this whole thing. I'd like to hear from you. Just reach out to me personally. I'd love to talk to you about this. And again, look at those articles in depth to get more information that wasn't covered in this video.